Let's go.
What does it mean to live a meaningful life? Is it an existence of ease and comfort? Is it a world where nothing goes wrong, nothing challenges us, and nothing gets in our way? Or is it something else? One odd fact about reality is how resistance makes us strong. Pushing heavy loads keeps our minds and muscles fit. You lift heavy weights to make even heavier burdens liftable, and you tackle tough problems mentally so that you are ready for harsher ones tomorrow. If we avoid this resistance, we atrophy. Our bodies and mind waste away. And when that happens, we won't be ready when we need to be. We won't be ready for that obstacle lurking around the corner. And make no mistake, there will always be an obstacle lurking around the corner, whether we want to face it or not. We can't make the world weaker, but what we can do is make ourselves stronger. What drives meaning then is not relaxation, but responsibility, of carrying heavy loads, of overcoming resistance. In games, a good villain is a common source of resistance for the player. The villain is the one who keeps our heroes from easily fulfilling their goals. Villains resist the player at every juncture. They challenge what the player and characters believe to be true. They force us to get better. In many ways, then, the villain is the one who makes playing a game meaningful. After all, if you played a game where you were never challenged, did you really play a game at all? It's questions like this that got Zeff and I wondering, what makes a good villain? Why do some villains stay in our minds decades after playing their games? What can we learn from them, and what can we apply to our everyday lives? This is Lessons from Gaming, or LFG. I'm GavelGamer, Gav for short.
Hey everybody, this is ZeffEpics, Zeff for short.
LFG is where we explore the real-life lessons we glean from the games we play on the screen. So a spoiler warning today, we're going to have more spoilers than usual from our prior episodes. The nature of talking about villains pretty much necessitates discussing who they are and what motivates them. We will try to keep our discussions to mid-game spoilers, but we may wade into later game material from time to time. We will try to warn you before we do that, but we can't be perfect. So if you are sensitive to spoilers for these games, you may want to skip ahead when we start discussing them. Again, we'll try to lead them with warnings for you, but just be on guard. Remember, only you can prevent spoiler sadness. Well, Zeff, I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say about this topic today, but I think I can lead us off. The first thing that I'd like to discuss when talking about villains is what I call stakes. Now, what are the stakes of a game? And I think that what stakes raise is a question, what is the villain threatening to ruin? After all, what a good villain contributes to a story is good conflict. And so if the villain isn't imperiling something that we care about, it's tough for the audience to really care. And so I think that stakes come down to a couple of dimensions, really two main ones and one auxiliary one, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. The first thing that I think the first dimension that we can talk about is the characters. So a villain needs to be threatening characters that we care about. You need to have characters worth saving. A second item is the world. The villain might need to be threatening a world that we care about. You have to have a world worth saving. And the third item, this is more auxiliary, is you can have a villain whose descent into villainy is worth studying. This is not about saving, it's about having a flaw that's worth avoiding. So many good villains, I think, will explore these dimensions in varying degrees, but having at least one will be really important. Because if you don't have one of them, then even the most odious villain will have difficulty eliciting any kind of emotional response from the audience. At best, they might attain a status akin to like a comic book caricature, but at worst, they'll just bore the player and they won't get the job done. So it really helps to be strong in at least one of these dimensions. So just to kind of unpack this a little bit, I can talk about maybe the characters to begin with. The reason why characters matter, even for the villain, even though they're not an aspect of the villain itself, is because players will feel impelled to stop a villain who threatens or has wronged characters that we love. And I think a good example of this is Final Fantasy VI. So the story of Final Fantasy VI is really the stories of its characters. The game is set up so that the first half of the narrative introduces the characters and their struggles. And the latter half comprises complete character vignettes that resolve every character's story arc before the final confrontation. And so the true plot of Final Fantasy VI is not really that terribly complicated, but what makes that game incredible is what we've learned about each of the playable characters along the way and why fighting for them is so important. And I think it culminates really well in the final dungeon of the game. Because unlike the rest of the game, the entire cast plays a role in the final dungeon. The party members help each other out directly, each clearing obstacles for the others that they need to progress. And the player is generally forced to use new team compositions that he or she has not used before. So this forges new implied relationships between party members that you may have not used before, but it gives everyone a stake in the outcome of the adventure. And it shows how everyone in this large cast must come together to defeat a common foe. I just think another quick example of this would be Final Fantasy VII, the next game in the Final Fantasy series. Again, you can't have Final Fantasy VII without Cloud, Barret, Tifa, and Aerith, and the others. That core group of four characters is one of the most recognizable and memorable ensembles in all of gaming for a reason. And the final bosses of that game are so compelling in part because they are so personal to the characters involved. We want to succeed because we want to see Cloud and his entourage succeed. So stepping back, getting to one of the other elements I wanted to talk about was just the world surrounding the villain. The reason why this is important is because players will yearn to stop a villain who threatens a rich world that is worth protecting. It shows the importance of world building. There are a lot of ways to do this. A lot of RPGs do this through NPCs, visual style, beautiful locales, side quests where you learn more about the world. But having a rich world will make a villain threatening that world all the more terrorizing. So I think a good example of this, at least in a game where personal characters are not quite as important, is actually the Legend of Zelda series. So unlike maybe modern Final Fantasy games, Link and Zelda are more representative archetypes than they are living characters. So, a couple elements in games like Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild stray from that approach a little bit and depict Link and Zelda as more embodied. But as a whole, I think the series tends to treat those characters more as representations and ideas than actual humanized characters. But nevertheless, one of the reasons why players want to stop Ganon or Ganondorf or whoever Zant, whoever the villain is in that particular game, is because the player has explored a rich world full of unique people and races, and all of them have something to live for, whether it's the people of Kakariko Village, whether it's the Gorons of Death Mountain or the Zoras from Zora's Domain. The player has been slowly introduced into the hopes and the dreams and the daily routines of all of these different races of characters, all of these various NPCs throughout the world. And so stopping Ganon and Ganondorf is required for that world to have a future. And so, Zeff, I think, I don't know if you've had any questions for me on that particular topic, but those were sort of the two main elements I wanted to talk about. The auxiliary one I'll get to later.
The very first thought that I had was, so I played Final Fantasy VI for the first time ever just this past year, and it felt like a very late entry for me. And I think the uniqueness of the characters that you mentioned is just such an important element. And I feel like the part that makes the stakes feel so real is because each character is so distinct and unique. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that character separation and how each of one of them can have a personal connection to, say, a villain, or how their personal life challenges relate to the villains.
One of the beautiful things about Final Fantasy VI is that character separation. It's how every one of the characters is unique, but they're unique in a way that's very easy to understand, but very poignant. They touch on many different tropes, going across many different types of games. So, for example, you have Locke, who's a swashbuckling adventurer, sort of a thief. He calls himself a treasure hunter, right? But you hear Locke's theme, you know when it's playing, but he has a soft heart, and you know a lot about Locke just by listening to his music and hearing a couple words from him, but watching him evolve throughout the game and understanding why he is the way that he is very important. But then you go from Locke, and then you have maybe the Figaro brothers, right? You have Edgar and Sabin, and those two are also very dynamic characters. You have Edgar, who's this more or less reluctant king, sort of a playboy, but who does really have a deep heart, who wants the best for his family, who wants the best for his brother, and wants the best for his people. And obviously, a very gifted tactician, both on the battlefield and as an engineer. And then you have someone like Sabin, right, who's kind of a musclehead, but he also has a very deep heart. And he does have a very unique and deep connection with his brother. And you see a lot of the turmoil that Sabin had to go through. And you can kind of just go through the list, right? Celeste, Terra, obviously. You just go down that long list. I think there are 14 playable characters, and each of them you might be able to summarize in a quick sentence or two, and you listen to their musical themes, and they perfectly encapsulate what that character is all about. But being able to hit every single one of those easily encapsulated ideas, I think makes the cast so memorable to this day. And it's knowing each of those characters and feeling a personal connection to each of those characters makes defeating the villain Kefka in that game all the more important because you've seen the extents to which Kefka has gone and will go to destroy everything. And you want to stop him because you've seen the damage that he can cause, and you know and you've lived with these characters throughout this long journey, and you want to stop at nothing to defeat him.
Yeah, and the character that stuck out to me the most, and I can't go into details without going super into spoiler territory, so I'm not. But Cyan's character was really tough for me. It made it very relatable. And the arc that he goes through and the torment that he goes through was one where his personal connection to wanting to defeat Kefka was completely different than the ones that you mentioned. And I love that about Final Fantasy VI. And I think that's why that game is so popular, is because you can find a character, identify it with that dimension of the character that you're talking about, and relate to it. And that's why so many people love it. So I think it's a really good point. The next one that I wanted to point out was in your world discussion, you talked about how it had to be real. And I think you would agree with this. It needs to be real, but doesn't have to be realistic for the villain to be interesting, right? Zelda
Oh,
isn't realistic.
100%. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
and I know you were saying that, but the point that is clear is you can be in this world as long as it has rules that make sense for the world that you're placed in. You care about that villain exhibiting those rules from within that world. You place yourself in that world and you take on the attributes and things that you wouldn't care about in our world, you can care about in the world of gaming because it does transpose you into that environment.
Oh yeah, no, 100%. So I think that one of the things that gamers do really well, I think same thing with fiction readers, is they have a really high threshold for their suspension of disbelief. And I think one of the things that you're getting at is that people who play games will allow game developers a long leash when it comes to understanding the internal logic of their world. For example, if there's magic, generally magic has to follow certain rules, and they will completely buy into that. And I think one of the ways where maybe game developers or writers can go astray is if they start to break or create too many ad hoc exceptions to those rules, sort of as an ad needed basis, maybe perhaps to fit a particular plot point. I think if you do that too much, or if you do it in too strong of a way, then players will break their immersion. Their sense of disbelief will be evaporated. And it's at that point that I think you've kind of lost the player. And a lot of what happens next in the game won't feel quite as compelling because at that point the player might throw up their hands and say, well, all the rules are out. So there's no reason to sort of learn this internal logic. But if the developers and the writers can stick to that internal logic, then that's, I think, one way that you can craft a very compelling narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that some of the most heated villain end game battles that people get really upset about are usually when they're doing exactly what you're saying. They break the rules too much. You're using a new skill or ability you've never had before. I mean, think of this is very spoiler, but think of Breath of the Wild's ending. You're using this new bow that you don't have the entire time. And it kind of makes sense in a sense. I know that there was a lot of criticism at the end of that game, but I think when you go so far outside the norm of what you've done for the whole time and you're kind of breaking too many rules and
Right.
it's boring, it's not engaging, that's what causes people to get upset. So I think you're totally right. When I think about what makes a villain super memorable, and it kind of relates a lot to what we were talking about, honestly, the thing that I think most of when I remember a villain is whether or not that I have some sort of personal connection to it. There's something in my history or my past that I can relate to that causes me to get more incentive or more desire to beat this person. So one game that I talk about a lot, or I will be talking about it again and again, I'm sure, is the game of Earthbound. We mentioned it a little bit briefly in the last episode, but the reason why I love Earthbound so much is that game has been pivotal to my life. It was the very first RPG I ever remember playing. It introduced me to the RPG series, and for me, it was what a wonderful one to enter is kind of the way that I look at. But there are several enemies in that game. But for this example, to kind of talk about this idea of a personal connection that makes you want to beat them more, I'm going to focus on Porky Minch. So Porky Minch is Ness's next door neighbor. Now, I grew up very, very poor. I used to say I didn't grow up poor. I grew up I grew up very, very poor. I lived in the country, and the family that lived next door to me had some very similar themes and elements of Porky's family. There was and it was my cousin. And just so everybody's clear, let me get this out of the way. My cousin and I are great today. Kids are kids. Things move on. There's nothing wrong. But growing up, there are times that you go through trials that as an adult you look back on and you're like, oh, that was a hard time when I was younger, but now I feel great about it and I learned a lot from it. But my cousin lived next to me and they had so many similarities. Porky and my cousin had so many, he was kind of the bigger blonde kid, was mean and patronizing, always insulting like his parents. He's always insulting Ness's parents, offhanded comments. And he kind of talks about him as if he's like not even in the room. And so beating Porky for me became important, not because I wanted to see Ness win the day, but because I started identifying myself as Ness and seeing in Porky this pariah in my own life that I was just like, I want to beat that person so much because I'm sick of these types of people, right? I'm so sick of them. And it was very cathartic in a way to kind of go after Porky, and you go after him several times in the games. But as I said, my cousin and I are great. We all go through these things, but that was my element, Gav, that I wanted to talk about is I think sometimes you get a villain and there's something that has happened in your life that you can relate to that villain. And you're just like, I want to beat the crap out of you just because I'm having frustration in my own life. And I don't know if you've ever experienced that, but that was my first element.
100%. And thank you so much for sharing that, Zeff. One of the things that I think Earthbound is so good for in that respect, which not a lot of games do anymore, is that the setting of Earthbound is so important, I think, for establishing that type of connection that at least a lot of North Americans had with that RPG, because it's strictly almost Americana, right? You grow up in a town that could be any kind of town across the United States. And I think that kind of a setting, I love fantastical universes, it's great, but for that particular setting, it allows, I think, kids of a particular age to really connect with that type of a game on a really deep level, especially in North America, because it's one of the few games that really has that type of Americana feel to it. It's so interesting that you brought up Porky, because Porky's friendship, to whatever extent it is a friendship with Ness, is actually a really critical idea in both Earthbound and even Mother 3. I don't know if you've played that game, but his friendship with Ness is actually something that's really deeply meaningful even to him, even though he doesn't necessarily want to admit it. It's one of these revealed preferences for Porky. So I guess my question to you is, do you think Earthbound in any way helped you mend your relationship with your cousin? You sounded to be on good terms now. Do you think that actually helped you in your real life?
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of the cousin, Harry Potter's cousin, Dudley.
Dudley?
Yeah,
Dudley,
Dudley. I was actually kind of really disappointed. There's a hidden scene, if anyone ever gets a chance to go watch the scene that they decide to cut out, but it's kind of Dudley's redemption story. He, of course, Vernon's being very rude to Harry Potter, and Dudley walks over and shakes his hand and tells him that he cares about him or something. I don't know. It's actually very heartwarming, and it was like his redemption. And you can tell they cut it out because they felt like, oh, we want to keep him as an unredeemable character or whatever. But I just think it was a mistake, because I think, to your question, people in life can sometimes wrong us. And if we offer kindness and grace and the opportunity for redemption, people will always have that opportunity to do the right thing. And if you don't give them the chance to do the right thing, you kind of set a bad precedent that you should just give irredeemable qualities to people forever. And I just don't believe that. So I think, yeah, I think Porky's redemption, or any other character like that, is an important facet that teaches us in life the importance of redemptions. I that's an element that I think that I've learned from it.
Do you think that those type of stories do teach you lessons? This is lessons from games, right? Have you ever noticed yourself likening something back to maybe a game that you played when you're dealing with a person, at work, personally, professionally, that you might need to use a lesson from a game that you've played?
So it's not the answer you're going for, but when you were saying that, the one that I actually thought of was Link, because I talk so much, and when I have conflict, sometimes I talk more. And I do think sometimes I'm like, I need to be more like Link. He does talk. We don't hear his voice because they wanted to make the link to the character, so they have chosen to not have us hear his voice. But he, of course, talks, but he's very precise and short, and he just gets to the point. And if you ever watch the dialogue in Zelda, he's very direct and to the point. And I think an example like that is all that I can think of. Is there are moments for me sometimes to just be, when I'm facing adversity, the lesson that I try to take out of it is maybe be a little bit more direct.
Well, there you go. Link's always a great character because, I mean, he's the quintessential hero. He helps everyone he sees. He befriends everybody, no matter who they are, right? Whether they are a Goron or a Zora or, a Gerudo, it doesn't matter. He has the power, the ability, the patience, to befriend everybody and to seek out their best interests on their behalf, and with their support. And I think that that's a very important message to have. And one reason why so many people even relate to Link, even though he never really says much. I mean, other than maybe the dialogue options that you choose for him, he doesn't really say anything in the games, except for, maybe a couple of things here and there. And I think one reason why people still have that deep connection to him is that he is a self-insert in a way. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that he is an archetype. He's an archetype of the archetypal hero. And what most people want to be at the end of the day is a hero in their own lives. And so, from that perspective, while Link might not be the most in-depth character as a character, there are still so many lessons that we can learn from him because of his archetypal nature that allow him to be a guide and allow him to be an example for all of us to follow in one way or another in different moments of our lives.
Absolutely, man. What was your second reason?
Yeah, so the first one was kind of a precondition. It was a precondition, again, the stakes. What is the villain threatening to do? What are they threatening to ruin? And again, that's not necessarily tied to the villain. It's tied to the sort of conditions around him. This one, though, is tied directly to the villain, and that is screen time. So, quick explanation of this. I think this one is simple to understand. Players will feel a stronger connection and a stronger compulsion to stop a villain that they know over one they just met. And so when villains get more screen time, we come to learn more about them. We learn to see what they do, how they react to evolving events, how their plans unfold. And so, again, I think generally it's more compelling when players can see this unfold organically over the course of a game rather than being told certain things just at the climax of a game when everything was really their doing all along, or oh, I was really calling the shots all along. I don't think that that's very compelling in the same way that oh, it was all a dream is not a very compelling ending to a story, because it's like, oh, well, then what was it then that we just did? I think villains have a similar relationship with their stories where the more we see them, the more connection we get to them, so that everything kind of seems to fit more naturally than that they just appear in the last few instances and the last scene of the game. And so I think that this consideration is more relevant necessarily for older games than newer ones, but there are still some modern outliers. So I think Just to give some examples of villains that had a really short screen time, this is Final Fantasy IV as an example of this. Final Fantasy IV has a number of different villains to them. It kind of changes throughout the game, but the ultimate villain, late game spoiler for Final Fantasy IV, is Zemus and Zeramus. And so this villain in particular, it's a cool, rad boss fight. It's great. But no one really talks about them as a meaningful villain. It's basically all just a spectacle for the final battle, which is a really cool final battle. I love Final Fantasy IV. I really love that battle in Final Fantasy IV. But again, I love Final Fantasy IV for other reasons. And while the final battle is really cool, great music, great artistry that's going on sort of in the background, great sprite work, no one really cares that much about Zeramus. It's a it's a very I don't mean to speak for everyone. I'm sure someone does, but you don't often see that character being talked about as a really interesting villain because really that villain just appeared in the final scene of the game without any explanation. And so because of that, characters and players have not really found a deep connection to that villain. And so even today, while Final Fantasy IV is loved, and I still love that game, my deep personal connection to Zeramus is not that reason. I think a more modern example, which I'm not going to go into too much detail about, is Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIII has, again, a number of villains to it, but a lot of them don't get that much screen time. And sort of, again, the final boss in Final Fantasy XIII, at least the first one, doesn't really appear until much later in the game, very, very late chapters in the game. And because of that, the player has not had enough sufficient time, at least in my estimation, to develop a really strong connection to that villain and really can understand the villain's motivations, why the villain is doing what they're doing. And yes, you can learn about him. Yes, he makes it obvious what he's doing towards the end. But I think at that point in the game, you've already played dozens and dozens and dozens of hours of the game, so that when you finally learn that when that final villain comes on the screen, sort of in this penultimate scene of the game, it just kind of elicits a, oh, okay, kind of reaction from the viewer rather than something really compelling. So those are two examples, I think, of really short screen times as villains and didn't really work. But I'd just like to get to a couple of ones that are longer and why it works. So obviously we can talk about, we've already talked about Kefka. I think Kefka is a really interesting villain. I think Sephiroth from Final Fantasy VII is another, because those villains mean so much more to us because the respective audiences have learned so much about their backstories and witnessed their descent into villainy on screen throughout the game. We've seen what motivates them, we see what drove them crazy or mad or bad, if you will. And we've seen that every step along the way in the entire journey of those games. And so I don't think neither of them would have been nearly as memorable had they just appeared in the final third of the game as a surprise actor who had been calling the shots all along. We really need to see those personal connections, for example, that Sephiroth has with Cloud, what he's threatening to do to the planet that Barrett loves, what Sephiroth has done to other characters, Tifa, Aerith, right? What he does to all of them is a deep, deep personal thing. And so when you finally reach that moment at the end of the game where you're challenging him, you want to stop him because you know what he has done to characters that you love. And it is really important that you succeed, not just for the world, but for people and characters that you really deeply care about. I think just another quick example, screen time doesn't have to be direct on the screen time. Screen time can be more implied by what's happening on screen without actually seeing the villain. And I think a good example of that is Lavos from Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger is a game that immediately stands on its premise. We know that Lavos is the villain pretty much within like the first hour, maybe two of the game, depending how quickly you're playing it. But nevertheless, he doesn't appear that much on screen. He doesn't talk to you really at all. But while we don't see him on the screen that much, the game is so clear that it's his will or its will. It's more of an eldritch abomination than that person. So we see how every scene in the game is Lavos exacting its will and directing events and manipulating people throughout the entire game. And so when players play Chrono Trigger, they interpret every scene of the game and every event happening in the game through that Lavos centric lens. players are well aware and have fought his influence over the world for like the last 20 or so game hours, which makes that final culmination of the battle and the final battle with him so meaningful because you know what you're up against, you know what he's capable of, and you know what he's done to the characters and the people that you love.
I think screen time is a really important part. As much as I'm gonna go heresy on Nintendo here because I know how beloved Nintendo is, and I am one of Nintendo's biggest fans. But with exception of some of the Xenoblade and other types of RPG characters and stuff like that, Nintendo I feel like suffers from this concept that you're talking about of screen time villains. When you think about things like Bowser or King K. Rool or any of these opponents
Or even
in
the Nightmare in Kirby, like the
yeah,
Nightmare in Kirby's Adventure is another one. Yeah.
all these villains, they never get any sort of character arc. They're barely on the screen. You're told that you're supposed to hate them. You don't really understand why. You just are, And I think that it makes them. Of course, Bowser. Bowser is iconic, but Bowser is iconic for the same reason that when you memorize something, you can remember it. He's just always there, so that's why he's iconic. I wouldn't say that he's on his own a memorable villain, not in the same way that some of these other villains that you talked about, where you actually only play against them in one game, but you remember them when you walk away. That's what we're talking about here, and I think there's an element that the you can overuse just that trope of they're just a bad guy or whatever. And I think your examples were really good, and it just made me think of Nintendo and how they just don't give proper screen time to their enemies.
Yeah, I think Bowser's an interesting example. I mean, one of the reasons why I brought up, I think it's called Nightmare, the very last villain that you play in Kirby's Adventure, is because this is another one of these villains who just kind of shows up in the last scene of the game. And the game kind of just tells you, oh, he was directing everything all along, and King Dedede is not that bad of a guy, which is fine. I love King Dedede. He's kind of a goofy guy, but he's an interesting villain. He's a really cool character in Smash Brothers. Love him. But when another character just kind of pops on the screen and it's, oh, I've really been doing this all along, you just didn't know, nothing suggested my existence, but here I am, fight me now. I think players will do it. We've all done it before. We play many games with that kind of a attack, but we don't find it very compelling. It doesn't really, I think, inure a deep, meaningful love for that particular villain or game. It's just, okay, I guess that's what the plot has done now, more than feeling a real deep connection with them. So 100%, I think that some of the older Nintendo games and some of their series in general can have a little bit of that problem. And I think you do highlight that a little bit. And we'll see if they change it. Certainly, some of their newer games appear to be taking a slightly different approach.
I think the examples of you don't have to have them on the screen with these big long monologues. The two that I think of are Sauron from Lord of the Rings series and the Emperor from the Star Wars series. You barely see those two people, but those two are definitely memorable villains, even though they barely get any screen time. And so it is possible to make your audience hate a villain, even though they've barely been on the screen. I just think it's something that sometimes games suffer from. My second element was essentially what I'm talking about, which is they're not just evil because the game told me they are. When I think about Ganon versus Ganondorf, there are big differences in the way that Zelda handles those two people. And as I've used the example, of Bowser, he's evil because we're told he's evil, and Mario hates him, basically. Now, he steals Peach and blah, blah, blah. But the point is, it's very surface level motivation to get rid of him. And the game that I really think that does a really good job of getting into the depth of why a person is a problem is my experience playing Fire Emblem Three Houses. Fire Emblem Three Houses is a great game because the villains change depending on your choices. So at the beginning of the game, you select a house, and that house sets forth a history that you go through. You go on these different paths. These different paths take you to different interactions with different people in different ways. And it's kind of like the old time travel conundrum of paradoxes of different outcomes, based on choices and selections. And all these characters, because you interact with them at different points. And in some cases, they're the good guy. In some cases, they're the bad guy. And it's all dependent upon your choices. And it's because these characters have incredible depth, and this is a game that me and you have talked about how we don't get as much time that we want to play games, and I'm always complaining about how I never get a chance to play as much games as I want to, but this is like a game that I sunk 350 plus hours into over time. It's just a behemoth of a game. There's so many options that you can play, but the reason why it works is because the motivation to eliminate your villains in that game are directly related to the depth that you get to know their characters and the depth that you explore within your character themselves. And I think that that is a really important piece to making sure that a villain or a challenge is memorable, is how deep does it go? That is why Fire Emblem Three Houses, which I can't even give you a name because the villains change, but it does such a great job of getting into the depth of why, for whatever scenario you are in, it matters to you, and what is at stake, and all this stuff that we've talked about. So just having some depth to the evil, having some reasons, I think that's just really critical.
So, Zeff, that's a really interesting point that you made. One of the things that leapt out to me, do you think it was meaningful that the mere fact that your choices will affect who the villain is make the villain more personal to you vis-a-vis your first point? How do you think that that plays into why you felt that that game had such good villains, in addition to the depth?
Only if you're able to empath heavily with the characters, because as the reason why I have 350 hours in it, and anyone that's played that game, most people, if you liked it, you didn't put 40 or 50 hours into it. If you liked it, you were in the triple digits for sure, because it's really easy to get entangled into the stories and the character developments, and that game is so deep in character development. As you start to go into these different choices of these different houses, you've got the Black Eagles and the Golden Deer and the Blue Lions. Just that choice right there, it reminded me a lot of my very first, it sounds silly, but my very first experience going to medieval times when I was a really young kid. I actually cared very deeply about the Blue Knight section that I was sitting in, and I wanted him to win. And it was like, why do I want him to win? I don't know, because I'm sitting there and everybody's cheering, and I want my knight to win because that's where I'm sitting. And if he messes up or if he loses, I'm like sad, and I'm like, why? But that's what that game does so masterfully well, is as soon as you're placed inside the role of whatever house you pick and you kind of go down that path, you really get drawn into that environment. You empathize very much with whatever that character is going after, even if it's something that in real life you might see or view differently. And I think that's why that game is so memorable, and the villain experience in that game is so memorable, is because it just can take you from being totally against something in one playthrough to totally for it in the next playthrough. And that's really challenging to do in a game, right? Usually good and evil is
Yeah.
very non-ambiguous and very clear, and it just does a phenomenal job of making you care about things in one playthrough and hate them in the next playthrough. And I just think that matters a lot.
Yeah, I guess one of the questions that I was having, you talked about empathy. Is it really limited to real life events? Could the personal connection also be something as broad as the personal outcomes of the choices that we make, even in game, right? I mean,
Oh
that
yeah.
it's personal to you insofar as you've chosen certain things, and the fact that the villain can change depending on those choices gives you a bigger stake in the outcome of that game than maybe if it had just been delivered to you on from on high.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That if you have a semblance of control, is kind of what you're talking about, to affect who the villain is, that in itself causes more engagement. I absolutely think that is at play, and I think that's a really good observation. And I think that's why anyone that has played Fire Emblem Three Houses, that's why they become there's kind of I'll say it, there's the Edelgard did nothing wrong stands. And if you've played that game, you know what that phrase means and why they say that. And then it's got its camps. And I love that about that game, because it really shows how the choices that we make, to your point, can really cause a little bit more of an engagement on that enemy. And it's very reflective of some of the villains that we create in our own lives. The choices we make sometimes sets the path for how much that resistance that we're against is a problem to us. So
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and that's a really good point too. One of the first things I try to teach my oldest daughter was that you control how people really behave towards you. When you enter a room, it's like almost like a form of mind control. If you're calm and collected, people are going to be calm and collected around you. If you aren't, then you'll see that people will also, if you aren't and you're more energetic and stressed out, then more people will around you will also be feeling that energy as well. So that's a really interesting point too about how we can control that in our everyday lives. Yeah, so I think the third thing is the motivation of the villain. Motivation is sort of the third dimension that I wanted to discuss. And I think that there are two subcomponents of that, and the first being relatively short. And I think that there are two main ways to do this. So to build, I think, some of that depth or that personal connection, I think, Zeff, that you've been talking about, is first and foremost, one way that you can do it is just to make the villain unequivocally diabolical. And when there's a question about this, I think one way of thinking about it is when you have a villain who is unquestionably evil, the player will have no qualms about stopping them at all costs. Those are the villains that you love to hate. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You need to stop them. And I think that's one way of building a decent villain. I think you see maybe this in Kefka, right? There you might see this in Lavos, right? There's no turning Lavos back. It's going to destroy the planet. You're not going to make Kefka a good person. Zofar from Lunar 2 is another one that just immediately stands out as the bad guy. There's nothing you're going to do about it. You will have no questions about whether you can turn them or not. I think, Zeff, you had mentioned Sauron and Palpatine. Again, unquestionably evil villains that you love to hate because there is no redemption in them. And so I think that that's one way that you can kind of go and building out and motivating a player to want to stop a villain is just by making them diabolical, making them do things on screen that just engenders this hatred, if you will, but just this desire of the player for wanting to stop them at all costs. Another way to do that, though, is building off what you had just talked about, which is giving them depth and giving them nuance. And what I wanted to talk about a little bit about this was you had mentioned how this can kind of relate to your own life. I think good villains often leave the player with a question. It's a question that acts as a razor between different ideas and philosophies. And often those questions will reveal emergent ideas about our physical and psychological world. They'll pose a question about humanity, and then they'll offer a hypothesis for a better and more productive world than the alternative, which is usually what the villain is proposing. These questions will be left with the player, and it's something that stays with them long after the game is over. And it's this question that players will often discuss decades later when they speak about the eternal questions that the human race faces. These are questions that you'll still be seeing asked on message boards or on social media in discussions about these old games. And I think there are two common forms of these questions. There are obviously many more, and they're very game specific, but two common forms of these questions are things like, would things have been different if only such and such happened? Or how would things have unfolded but for such and such thing happened, depending on the game? And no matter what the form they take, though, the question often reveals a hypothesis about how we are supposed to live our lives. And I think one way that you can achieve that is through the use of foils. We often see this as a very common technique in all media, but video games as well. And just for those who don't know, a foil is a character that contrasts with another to emphasize or contrast certain qualities, philosophies, or ethics about in those two characters to emphasize them and to usually make a point about that difference. And so often character foils share significant similarities between them, but will differ in some aspect of their philosophy or outlook that highlights the different worlds those attitudes will bring about. It's usually with a protagonist, but it need not be. And so the use of foils is one way that I think games can make this hypothesis and say, look, There may be two ways or more of addressing a problem. If you address it, there's sometimes one way to address a problem, but it could be more destructive. There could be another way to address the problem, and it might be more constructive. And what the games will do is they'll use these foils to give the player these hypotheses that leave the player with this question of, okay, I think I see the way forward, maybe in my own life or ways of looking at ethical questions or philosophical questions or metaphysical questions. And this game, or particular games, for example, this game has a certain hypothesis and others may have others. But what can I learn from that? So again, usually the foils are with the villainous, with the protagonist. We'll get that to a bit. I think you don't have to have that, though. You can definitely have foils between NPCs. Just as a quick example of that, Chrono Trigger, spoiler alert. I think a good NPC example of this is the foil relationship between maybe Queen Zeal and Scala. Both of them grow up in the same time period. They both have strong magical powers, vis-a-vis and from Lavos. But Scala yearns to transcend Lavos's influence while Queen Zeal is corrupted by it. And you can just see how the game treats both characters as foils for each other because that slight little tweak in their outlook and what they want to do makes all the difference in the world. But the main one that I wanted to talk about was from Xenoblade Chronicles 2. So this is going to get a little spoiler heavy. There are many foils in this game, but the ones that I wanted to talk about very briefly were Rex and Amalthus and Malos and Mithra. So between Rex and Amalthus, Rex is the protagonist, Amalthus is one of the main antagonists. Both of them are people who endured terrible trauma. They are both master drivers, which means that they can drive any blade. They both drive Aegis blades, which are the most powerful blades. We'll get into that in a little bit. But where the game makes them a foil is where Amalthus's trauma caused him to want to destroy the world due to the suffering and the corruption that he saw. Rex saw the same trauma and wanted to transcend it to build something brighter than what came before. And for another foil, just to build onto that, I said that both of those drivers drove Aegis's blades. And so two of the main Aegises in Xenoblade Chronicles 2 are Malos and Mithra. Both of them are Aegis blades from the Trinity processor. And for one reason or another, both at the beginning of the game, both are set on a particular kind of destruction. Malos of everything, and Mithra for something much more localized. Both are beset by destruction to begin with. But there's a very slight difference in their outlook that just changes everything. So there's this idea in Xenoblade Chronicles 2 that blades, which are these creatures that are immortal, they can live forever, but they wake up when someone touches them, basically who's worthy, and then when their driver dies, they go back into what's called their core crystal. There's this idea that blades will take on some of the characteristics of the drivers who control them and awaken them. And so Malos is Amalthus's blade. And Malos took Amalthus's hate for humanity and desire to destroy it with him. Now, Mithra, whom Rex awakened, she also was, again, wanted and desired a particular type of destruction. But Rex's optimism and his desire to transcend trauma was imparted onto her as well when he woke her up. The game leaves the player with the suggestion that Rex and Rex alone could save her, and that her uncontrolled power was the crux of her own trauma. And so Rex was the only one who could both control her power, but also never abuse it. And through that, showed her a different way, where Malos had a descent into destruction. Mithra was able to transcend it. And so the question that I think that the game poses the player is, and actually does this literally, is would Malos had been different had Rex been his driver? And the game actually poses this question, and Malos actually answers it. He says, no, I would not have been different. I don't think that's right. I don't think that he's a reliable narrator already due to Amalthus's influence. My hypothesis for that game is that yes, Malos would have been different. He would not have sought the destruction that he did had Rex been his driver. I'm not going to argue that hypothesis here, but it's just one of those many questions that Xenoblade fans still talk about today, even though that game released 7 years ago. It's a question that people will still be talking about. It's one of those lingering questions and thoughts that give players something to consider long after the game's over. And I think that's an example of where we can learn lessons from games.
I actually loved a lot of what you were saying, and the very first thing that you're saying, it reminded me of a psychological principle called the dark triad. It's basically a person who exhibits the three worst characteristics of the human condition, which are narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy. When you have those three, you're pretty irredeemable, right? You're cold. You are unable to be empathetic. You are very calculated, and the Machiavellianism. You're there to take advantage of and use your any advantage by any means necessary to achieve your goals, and do it in a way that is very destructive. And obviously, if you're narcissistic, you're only thinking of yourself. So it's very easy when you have a villain that exhibits a dark triad.
No, no, that's great. So two quick points to that. So you talked about the Dark Triad. I mean, you just played Final Fantasy VI. Do you remember what the statues were called? That the source of all magic, the gods?
I
They're
don't.
called the Warring Triad.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had not put that connection before, but yeah, the Dark Triad, as soon as you said that, I was thinking of Kefka and the Warring Triad from Final Fantasy VI, because what does he do? He starts messing around with the balance between the statues, and that's what throws the world into turmoil,
Mm.
which is really interesting. Interesting. Okay.
My third point of what I consider a very memorable villain is if there's a moral ambiguity or a very relatable reason for their villainous nature. But there are certain villains where you can understand why they became evil. You can actually empathize to a degree of why they became evil, and it makes you sad. It makes you sad because you almost see it happening in slow motion. Or the game that I thought of when I was thinking of this concept was God of War, the new one with Kratos and his son. There are definitely times where they are not relatable in their motivations or all the things that we've talked about, right? There satirically, you think of like Dr. Evil from like Austin Powers, who literally just wants to blow up the world. Why? It's never explained. He just wants to blow up the world. To even like a slightly better example of Thanos, right, from the movies, he's trying to destroy half the galaxy. At least it kind of made some sense, but you never really understand what got them there, what evolved, what happened to them. But there are some times where I can listen to a story of a villain origin story and say, yeah, I get it, I understand. I don't condone or support what they're doing, but I understand why it would be very frustrating. And there's a character in God of War, and this is spoiler only in backstory, not in plot, so it's not going to affect the game plot. But there's a character of Balder, which is from obviously the lore. Balder is the son of Odin, and his mother is Freya. Freya hears a prophecy that her son is going to die, so she panics. She comes up with an enchantment to prevent his death. Unfortunately, she over-rotated on this enchantment, and it worked so well that it went all the way to the other direction. He can't feel pain. He has no feeling. He can't taste. He can't smell. He can't, nothing. He loses it all. So she became so scared of him dying that he lost everything, and turns into this moment where he's complaining to his mother, and he says, hey, I'm not able to smell. I can't even feel the temperature. I mean, he walks around hell, this place that is a frigid. In God of War, it's not, if anyone hasn't played it, hell is very, very cold as opposed to very, very warm. It's the frozen. It's so frozen that frostbite, when you walk outside, it's very, very cold. But he's walking around hell shirtless, because he can't feel anything. It doesn't matter, and he's looking for any moment to feel something. And there's this really key moment where Freya asks him, like, well, what would you have rather have died? And he goes, to never feel again? Yes, I would have rather died. I think about it, and I think about, what would your life be? You were talking about the importance of resistance, the importance of overcoming things and growing from them. And honestly, if you have pain but you can't learn from it, or you can't grow from it, or you have the inability to react to the pain in some sort of way, that could turn you crazy to the point where you act out and you are doing bad things. And so as I watched and learned more about Balder, all I could say is I sat there and I was like, I get it. I get why he's angry. I get why he's upset. Would I guaranteed do the same thing? I'd hope not, but like I can look at his pain and suffering that he's going through and understand why he turned evil and what, his slow descent into madness and his anger and his frustration. Imagine just being able to walk around and not feel anything, not taste anything, not smell anything. It would drive you crazy once you've had it and then it's taken away and now you're immortal and you've lost all of that. It would drive you crazy.
Oh yeah, 100%. And yeah, very interesting example. I think what you just said is an implicit hypothesis there about what life is like, what fills us with meaning. There is this unstated hypothesis. Again, I keep coming back to that word because it's a guess. It's not being told to you. It's not an answer, but it is maybe a question or a hypothesis as to what makes life meaningful. How can you live a more productive life? And I think, that resistance that you were talking about, is pain really all bad? And it's, well, no, because as we all know, right, one of the reasons why you feel pain, right, is so that you know when something's going wrong, right? So you know not to put your hand on a hot stove because if you didn't feel that, well, you might burn your hand, immeasurably. There's just this interesting idea that yes, pain is pain, pain's real, and pain's a bad thing, but there is a way of turning it around to using it to your advantage, or at least using it to learn helpful things about the world.
This is kind of maybe a tough topic for some people, but many of us are so motivated to never experience even the slightest bit of discomfort that we don't realize how far behind in life it puts us. I don't want to hear viewpoints that I don't like. I don't want to like experience any sort of physical resistance so I don't ever work out and work on my body. I don't want to be in a situation where somebody might get mad at me or might expose me as not being as smart as I am or whatever the case may be. We all get in those moments where we want to stay wherever there is no pain or no risk of pain or no risk of discomfort. And all you're doing is lowering your resilience and your resistance to it. To your point, you have to learn, but you also have to learn grit, and you have to be able to experience pain and suffering sometimes to get stronger on the other side. There was a 19th century philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, who's credited with coining the phrase, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." And I know it's cliche, but the question is always, is it just a catchphrase? There was this really fascinating study in 2010 done where they asked about 3,000 people over the course of several years. They asked them if they experienced any of 37 negative experiences. This included anything and everything you could think of: deaths, divorce, illness, assault, financial hardships, natural disasters, anything, all the major ones that you would consider, of death of a family member, any of those things. They gave their answers over these several years. And the interesting thing, Gav, is the results found that people who experienced very few trials, so the people at the bottom that experienced the least amount of trials, they rated their lives as more stressful, had more self described impairments, and rated themselves less happy overall to their counterparts who experienced more. So it just shows that resistance, that's trauma, those tough moments, they strengthen us, they make us happier as people, and we have to be able to look at those similar to the way that we look at these villains in these games. They are something that make you appreciate the good when you win or when you finish it. It's very satisfying when you complete a game and you have beaten a very tough or challenging boss. I think that's what we're hitting on here, which is you have to have a good villain or a good problem in your life can help you grow in ways that successes can't. And if you only live your life around that which is comfortable, you don't grow from it and you don't learn. And it's a principle that I'm very passionate about. That's why I force myself sometimes into situations that I know that I'm going to be uncomfortable. It's because I learn
Yeah.
most in those moments.
Yeah. I mean, you never know what you are capable of until you challenge yourself to do it. And That it's a good way to bookend, I think, the intro, insofar as I think what I said was, it's not about making the world around you weaker. It's about making you stronger, which I think goes exactly to what you've been talking about right now, especially and what that study found. So there seems to be some empirical evidence for this as well, and that's what villains do in these games. They stop the player from achieving their aims. They stop the characters from getting what they need to get, but it's that resistance that makes the whole journey worthwhile.
All right, Gav, I think it's time to jump into some comments. Once again, everyone, thank you so much for watching, listening, and giving us this opportunity to review and look at your comments. The first one that I'm going to go over is from Felix at FlexYo. He said under our X post, he said, patience under stress. That's what school did, and video games helped me learn that skill more. And I absolutely agree. The stress that video games make you learn from and exhibit are huge. So I just thought back when you did that and I was like, what was the most stressful time? And Gav, I'd love to hear yours, but I thought back about what was the most stressful time that I had to learn patience and operate under stress. And I think the one that comes to me is Final Fantasy X has tons of mini games that test your patience and stress, the chocobo race, the many other things, but the one that always bothered me was the lightning dodge. You actually have to dodge lightning bolts by pressing a button after a flash, a half second after a flash, 200 times. And Gav, there was one time where I dodged 198 times and there's no counter on the screen. So, basically I didn't know that I missed it, but I made a mistake and I ran back to the thing and the guy told me you've done it 198 times and to get the ultimate weapon, you had to do it 200 times. So I was so angry. I got up, I walked out of the room. My roommates were like, what's wrong? I said, I don't want to talk about it. And I think I did it 2 days later or something like that. But that was my most patient and stress time. What was yours?
Oh my gosh, dude, the infamous lightning dodges. That's incredible. I was going to talk about maybe some like Elden Ring bosses or, other types of really hard bosses, but what you just brought up brings to mind another memory that I have playing Super Mario RPG, which has a very kind of similar system for trying to get the ultimate armor in the game. That requires you to do 100 super jumps in a row on the same enemy. And I guess it doesn't have to be on the same enemy, but 100 super jumps in a row. And it's pretty tough to do. It's easy kind of to do the first maybe 20 or so, but after that, I think you only have a couple frames to hit some of these jumps. And so to do that 100 times in a row is not exactly a trivial exercise. And I just remember there was one time I was actually recording it on my Switch. I got 99 in a row, and then I failed, I think, just out of sheer desperation on just the last jump. And I just put the controller down. I was like, you got to be kidding me. I
That's
walked away.
nuts.
And then
Yeah.
I came back. I listened to some Super Metroid music. I just came back and just knocked it out after that. But I just remember looking up in disbelief at the screen. It was like 99 hits, and then on the 100th one, I failed and I didn't quite get it.
It's
I
crazy
just
that you and I had almost the exact same experience just in two different games. And I
Yeah,
would say that was one of the biggest quality of life improvements of the new one, but they put the counter right on the screen
they
during
did.
it.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and I think the hard thing about that jump thing is that, the timing of it changes. It speeds up and slows down. And that always threw me off. That one was definitely tough. I could see that being stressful.
Yeah.
So what about your
Yeah.
comment, Gav?
Next one comes from Curse of the Socks. So at Curse of the Socks on YouTube. And what he talked about was this game, the series, the Legend of Heroes Trail series. And so in the game, there's this fictional mental technique called the unclouded eye. And that involves solving a difficult mystery in part by letting go of preconceived notions. And so what Kerr says is that that technique helped him solve real world problems by teaching him how to approach certain problems with a more objective eye. And that allowed him to reach solutions that otherwise may have been difficult to find due to maybe notions, biases, or other kind of preconceived solutions that he may have he may have built in his mind. And Zeff, I thought that was an excellent post because it ties precisely into the type of skill that people can and do use in their everyday lives. What Curse is describing here is an important technique. I often sometimes see it referred to as reasoning from first principles. This technique tries to assess a question using only the most fundamental, non-controversial assumptions and ignoring the more tenuous premises that we might take for granted along the way for one reason or another. And the technique can be really helpful in trying to see what a solution might come to mind to a particular problem, what that might look like if we could solve the problem more directly and in a more objective fashion than dealing and including other assumptions, formalities, or opinions that might otherwise get in the way. I know that I use this tactic all the time, even as an attorney. While my job is typically one of an advocate, the best advocates often try to look up things more objectively so that they know, for example, how certain arguments might hit a more neutral party, like a judge or a jury, or the best way to advocate for your clients without stretching the truth too much, for example, right? What you can and cannot say because you know what the facts might reveal. And so I just thought that that was an excellent technique to learn from a game because it's something that people can and do use all the time. So I thought that was a great comment. Thank you so much, Curse.
Yeah, and honestly, that's something that even in my job, I know that there are many psychological principles that they teach about meeting people where they are and making, whatever you're presenting or doing it from their lens rather than your own. I just think that that's a really smart principle as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and so to close us out here, again, if you have comments, if you're still with us, first of all, thank you so much for staying with us. But if you have any comments, what are some of your elements that you'd like to see in villains? What do you think makes a good villain in video games? We'd love to hear it. Drop a comment, whether it's either on YouTube, Twitter/X, or any other way. Let us know. Our YouTube handle is Lessons from Gaming LFG. Like and subscribe if you like. If you want to hear this video, if you're liking it on there or listening on there, that's great. We also have this on Spotify and Apple. We are going to post it, I believe, to X and Twitter as well. So drop us a comment, drop us a like, let us know what you think, and we can read your comments in the next episode. As for handles, I'm GavelGamer. My handle on Twitter /X is @GavelGamer. I'm speaking with ZeffEpics. His is Zeff is @ZeffEpics. Is there anything else that you think we need to say to close us out here, Zeff, or is that it?
Just appreciate you learning with us, and we very much appreciate everyone. So we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Thank you. Keep gaming.